So welcome everyone to the fifth COINFLIPS Seminar talk. Today I am delighted to introduce Dr. Katie Schuman, who is an assistant professor at the Department of Electrical Engineering and Computer Science at the University of Tennessee. Katie is also a really strong member of our COINFLIPS project, so I'm so excited to have her here today. Katie got her PhD at the University of Tennessee in 2015 and previously worked at Oak Ridge National Laboratory. Katie co-leads the 10 Lab Neuromorphic Computing Research Group at the University of Tennessee and has over 100 publications. Today, Katie will be presenting on evolutionary algorithms for codesign. So with that, Katie, I'll let you take it away. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Darby. So you're going to get a crash course today in evolutionary algorithms and how our group uses them more broadly for co-design across the compute stack. We've particularly used it in the within the realm of neuromorphic computing, but I'm going to also touch on a little bit how we've used it so far for COINFLIPS as well. So I just wanted to get this advertisement out there. I am part of and co-lead the 10 Lab Neuromorphic Computing Group at the University of Tennessee. If you want to learn more about us, we have our website, neuromorphic.ecs.utk.edu. We have researchers across the compute stack where we're looking at materials and devices, architectures, software, and algorithms and applications. So we span across the EECS department here at UT, and we have affiliated faculty at a variety of other institutions. We also have a huge number of students, graduate students, undergraduate, and even high school students who have contributed to the work that we're doing. So I just wanted to go ahead and get this acknowledgement out of the way. A lot of the work that you're going to be seeing is really strong collaborations with the folks you see on the slide here, in addition to the COINFLIPS team. So before I tell you about evolutionary algorithms in the construct of co-design, I just want to give you a little bit of a background on evolutionary algorithms themselves. So as you can probably tell by the name, we take inspiration from the biological process of evolution, with the recognition that the biological systems that we are today and that we interact with today resulted from an evolutionary process. And there are characteristics of these systems that we would really like to try to capture as part of our evolutionary inspiration in our evolutionary algorithms. So biological systems are robust, they're complex, and they're adaptive. These are characteristics that we would like to see in many things that we would be interested in optimizing. So the idea behind evolutionary computation, evolutionary algorithms more broadly, is that we're attempting to take inspiration to copy some of the aspects from natural evolution to give us the automatic solution of complex problems. So you can really think of evolutionary computation, evolutionary algorithms as an optimization process that's inspired by evolution itself. So there are four key pillars of biological evolution that we're trying to bring into the process of artificial evolution. So the first is the idea of a population. So in evolutionary optimization more broadly, instead of having a single individual that you're iterating on and optimizing that one individual and tuning that one individual, you instead have a population. You have a group of several different individuals, and you're iterating over that population instead of just the single individual. And within that is another key pillar of evolution, which is diversity. So you want the individuals in your population to have different characteristics. This diversity is key to the evolutionary process and key in the optimization space in really exploiting and exploring the optimization space. Another key pillar that we're taking from biological evolution is heredity or inheritance, where characteristics are transmitted over the course of generations. And the fourth key pillar is selection. In this case, you can think of this like survival of the fittest, natural selection. Individuals make more offspring than the environment can support. So if you're better at surviving, you will make more offspring. So these four key pillars that we're taking from biological evolution inform what we're doing in artificial evolution. So artificial evolution is the automatic generation of solutions to hard problems. Again, it's an optimization procedure. Some of the similarities between natural and artificial evolution, those 4 key pillars that I just talked about, population, diversity, selection, and inheritance, those are key in the way that we perform artificial evolution. But we also have the idea of genotypes, which is the genetic representation that we're using, and phenotypes, which is ultimately the thing that we will be optimizing or evaluating. And this could be something like a computer program, an object shape, a robot, a circuit, whatever you can imagine that you would be interested in optimizing. Now, some of the key differences between natural and artificial evolution. In artificial evolution, we have a concept of fitness. It's the measure of the performance of an individual within our population. And in artificial evolution, there's a specific problem that we're trying to solve. So we have a specific fitness function that is going to be the driver for what we're actually trying to optimize. So selection in artificial evolution is determined according to the performance criterion, which is that fitness function. Natural evolution, it's hard to quantify what the fitness function actually is. It's much more complicated than what we're doing in artificial evolution. We also expect to see improvement from our initial population individuals and the final solution in artificial evolution. So if you were wanting to apply an evolutionary approach to your problem, you have to take these steps. You have to decide what your genetic representation is going to be. We're going to talk more about all of these aspects. You have to design some sort of fitness function, which is how you're evaluating different solutions, the score you're assigning to those solutions. You have to choose a selection method, how you are preferentially selecting better performing individuals. You have to choose the way you're going to do reproduction operations. For example, how you're going to do operations like crossover and mutation. We'll talk more about what those mean in a moment. And you have to choose some sort of stopping condition. Like, are you going to stop your evolution when you reach a certain value of your fitness function? Are you going to do it for some number of generations? Are you going to do it until you just get some sort of good enough evaluation, or if the fitness function score has plateaued over time? Once you have these things in place, you can apply evolutionary algorithms to pretty much any problem domain. That's what I love the most about them. The joke in the evolutionary algorithms community is that they're the second best way to solve any optimization problem. In any given domain, there's usually like a better optimization approach customized to that particular domain. But evolutionary algorithms, you can throw at pretty much anything. And if you don't know where to start, they're a good place to start in trying to address your problem. So just to give you an idea of what the flow looks like for the evolutionary algorithm, in this particular example, we have a genetic representation, which is a binary string. So our genome is 1s and 0s. We're not telling you here what the phenotype is, what the actual manifestation of this gene is. Doesn't really matter for the purposes of this example. So what we do is we start with an initial population of potential candidate solutions with sort of randomly initialized binary strings. And then we do an evaluation procedure. This is where we take the fitness function and we apply it to each of the individuals in the population, and we get a score for how well they're performing. Then we do a selection procedure to select which of those individuals are going to get to survive and reproduce. In this case, the top 3 individuals are chosen from that pool to get to survive. And then reproduction happens where they are duplicated and cloned into some number of children. So you can see the lowest performing one that was selected with a fitness score of 3 was cloned twice. And then the one with a fitness score of 6 was cloned 3 times, and the one with fitness score of 9 was cloned 4 times. So in this particular case, the higher the fitness value, the more children that were produced. And then crossover and mutation happens. So these are another way to tweak on the children that are produced. What happens in crossover is that pieces from two of the individuals in our parent population are exchanged, and that's what's happening here. This piece came from this individual down here, and this piece came from that one, and they were swapped. And then mutations are just small random changes that are happening throughout the individuals. In this case, they're bit flips in the binary string. Once those new set of population has been produced, we repeat this process. We go back to evaluation, we do selection, reproduction, crossover, mutation over and over again. And each step around this cycle is what's called a generation in an evolutionary algorithm. So to go a little bit deeper into each of these 4 different components, We're really actually going to dive into just the first three because the fourth one is by far the hardest thing to determine. So the first is devising a genetic representation. How do you decide what that representation should be? So I'm just going to give you one example in this initial discussion of evolutionary algorithms, and then I'll tell you more about them as we go through the rest of the presentation. But one way that you might represent your genome in your population is a discrete representation, which is a sequence of L discrete values drawn from an alphabet with cardinality K, for example, binary strings of some fixed length like 8. So these can be mapped to very different phenotypes. So even if this one genotype here, this binary string, it could be mapped to an integer. It could be mapped to a real value within a particular range. Or it could be mapped to something like a job schedule, where you have a list of jobs and you're determining whether they're going to happen in the morning or the evening. This particular genotype can manifest itself into a wide variety of different phenotypes. So you have to decide how you are going to represent what it is you're trying to optimize. Maybe you want to use a discrete representation. Maybe it makes sense to have some other representation that you're using. Some examples of other representation types include just a sequence of real values, trees or graph-like structures, or sequences. All of these can be used in evolutionary approaches as the genotype that you then manifest into a phenotype, which is actually ultimately the thing you're interested in optimizing. You also have to choose a selection method. There are a wide variety of different selection approaches that are discussed in the evolutionary algorithm literature. They've been studied extensively. And the goal with the selection approaches is that you're always balancing the trade-off between exploration and exploitation. You want to still be exploring your environment. You want to have enough diversity in your population so that you have that exploration taking place in your optimization, but you also want to be exploiting some of the good solutions that you found. So one of the more popular and robust selection approaches that's used in evolutionary algorithms more broadly is called tournament selection. And what happens in tournament selection is for every offspring that you are going to need to generate, you pick a tournament from your population. So you pick a fixed number of individuals. In this example, we're showing 3 individuals or contestants that are going to participate in your tournament. And those are randomly selected from your population. From there, you choose the individual within that tournament from your set of contestants with the highest fitness. And that is the individual that gets to survive and reproduce. And then you take all of those contestants and you throw them back in the population. So, and repeat this process for however many offspring you need to generate. So in this particular example, you see 3 different individuals were selected. It happened to be that one of those individuals was the highest performing individual in the population with the highest fitness score, and that was the individual that would be selected. But because you're randomly selecting these contestants from your population, it's entirely possible that you would have selected the 3 lowest performing individuals in the population. And in that case, you would be returning as your offspring the 3rd lowest performing individual in your population. So it's this idea of that random selection from your population as part of your tournament that still gives you the opportunity to select poorer performing individuals in your population that might be just a mutation away from being a good individual. So this gives you maintaining diversity in your population while still preferentially selecting better performing individuals to survive. And that tournament size, the number of contestants you're selecting, that's a hyperparameter for tournament selection. And the larger that tournament size is, the higher the selection pressure is. So you're more likely to be selecting better performing individuals the larger your tournament is. So crossover and mutation are the mechanisms by which we're doing exploration in the search space. So we start with our original individuals that are randomly initialized. Crossover and mutation allow us to generate new individuals. So these are the reproduction operators. How crossover works depends on what your representation is, but if you happen to have, for example, a string of characters in your discrete representation, or maybe a list of real values, you might do something like 1-point crossover, where you have two parents and a randomly selected crossover point is chosen along that, that genome. And then you create the children by taking pieces from each of those parents to construct both of those children. And so here, parent 1 is orange, parent 2 is blue, and you see the genetic material that comes from each of the parents and each of the children. This can be generalized to k-point crossover, where you split across some number of randomly selected crossover points. I'm showing an example for 2-point crossover, but this can be generalized for different values of k. You can also do uniform crossover, where each gene is chosen from either parent with equal probability. Or depending on your representation, if you happen to have a real valued representation, for example, you can do something like arithmetic crossover, where the child that results from the crossover operation of two parents is something like the mean of each of the individual genes. So how you select the way crossover is done can affect the way your evolutionary approach is proceeding. I don't have slides for mutation, but you can imagine the way that mutation works would be flipping one of these from blue to orange if your space was binary, or in the case of a real valued representation, applying a small noisy value to any one of the real values. Feel free to jump in if anybody has questions at any point. Raise your hand, put it in the chat. I'll try to keep an eye out for that throughout. Okay, so this last aspect is by far the hardest aspect of evolutionary approaches, which is defining how you evaluate the solution to your problem. Throughout the rest of the presentation, I'm going to give you concrete examples of what our fitness function looks like. I'm also going to give you cautionary tales about being careful what you wish for when you are defining your fitness function, because it can be quite finicky. The evolutionary approach will return you exactly what you told it to optimize, which may not be exactly what you wanted it to optimize. So one of the really interesting use cases from my perspective of evolutionary approaches is using evolutionary algorithms to do electronics design in all aspects of electronics. And of course, that's what we do. But there's a lot of really compelling reasons why you want to use evolution for today's electronics, today's hardware, today's circuits, today's devices, whatever. So one of the key interesting facts about using evolution is that you can use a simulation of your hardware or your circuit or whatever, or if you actually happen to have the physical system, the physical device, you can totally use that physical system in the loop for evolution. We call that hardware in the loop. So you can target directly to the physical chip that you have and not just a simulation. This can be especially important if you have like process variation from chip to chip. You can target it to that particular system. And as that system changes over time, you can use evolution to adapt your solution to the changes of that particular chip. This is a big one. I mentioned this is that evolutionary algorithms, when you absolutely have no idea how to even start solving your problem, throwing evolution at it can give you a pretty good place to at least get a handle on what's happening. So if you don't have a complete specification, and let's be real, when do we ever have a complete specification of what we need our system to do? You can use evolution if you have just sort of a vague idea of how it needs to perform. If you can define that as part of your fitness function, you can use evolution to drive that process. You can also use evolution to come up with solutions that have a better use of resources relative to some conventional design process. Because the evolutionary process can discover entirely new ways to configure systems, to configure devices that you as the human designer may never have thought of, but that work and maybe that use the resources more efficiently. They can be applied in contexts where systematic methodologies of conventional design do not exist. So they're really popular in the space of analog chip design because we don't have systematic methodologies for designing systems in analog. But of course, they can also be used when you do have systematic methodologies and maybe get a better use of resources. You can deal with multiple objectives. We're going to talk more about that later in the talk. And we're always keeping in mind the idea of how we're verifying the ultimate system that we are producing. And so what that means is you have your fitness function that's being used to score how well your individuals are performing. You have to scope that to a particular operational envelope of your system. But in your verification procedure, you want to make sure that you're really capturing all of the different components of how you want your system to perform that you may not be able to take into account during the evolutionary process. So you have to factor in this design verification throughout. So with all of that in mind, you now have your crash course in evolutionary approaches, and I'm going to tell you about the evolutionary system that we've created for neuromorphic systems specifically, and then I'm going to give you some case studies of where we've applied evolution in co-design. So in my graduate research, when I was looking at spiking neural networks for neuromorphic hardware systems, I precisely ran into that issue of we have no idea how to even start on coming up with the right spiking neural network for a given problem or a given hardware configuration, especially if we're using new devices and materials that haven't been used before. And so that led me to evolution for precisely the reason of like, I don't know where to start. Let me throw evolution at it to see how it's going to work. And it's been a productive tool for us. So this tool is called EON's Evolutionary Optimization for Neuromorphic Systems. And the genetic representation that we use here is not a binary string. It's not a string of real values. It's a graph or a network of nodes and edges. We think of them as neurons and synapses, but EONs can just be used more broadly for nodes and edges. So what we do is we start with a random initialization because we assume we know nothing about what our spiking neural network should look like for that particular neuromorphic hardware backend that we're targeting. And so you can see our initial population here has 4 individuals in it. Typically, our populations have between 100 and 1,000 individuals. Those individuals are different. They have different numbers of neurons. They have different numbers of synapses. The parameters are different across those. With EONs, we don't have any restrictions as to what the connectivity of the networks can look like, unless the hardware backend that we're targeting has restrictions. But in general, if the hardware doesn't have restrictions on connectivity, we don't impose any restrictions on connectivity, which means that the networks that we produce can look kind of weird. So we start with this initial population, and then we evaluate and rank them. So we have some sort of fitness function that we're applying that allows us to score each of these individuals. Usually what's happening is we are taking each individual, loading it into a simulator of our hardware or onto the hardware itself. We have done hardware in the loop EONs as well. Running it on the task, or more usually a simulation of the task. So if you're doing something like classification, we're running it on the training set for the data, and our fitness score is the accuracy on the task. If we're doing some sort of control application, there is some score associated with how well it's doing, some reward or whatever. We have that fitness score that we then assign to each of the individuals in the population, which allows us to rank them from best to worst. We use tournament selection to preferentially select the better performing networks to serve as parents. And then our reproduction operators are custom to this representation. So we do both crossover and mutation. And so just to give you an idea of what crossover might look like, so hopefully you can see my mouse. This individual here is a child of these 2 parents. And you can see its inherited characteristics from both of its parents. The sort of outer connectivity that you're seeing has come from this parent, and this inner connectivity has come from this parent. So it is taking that idea of crossover in the sort of traditional genome that you saw previously. You're still inheriting characteristics from both parents. Yes, we have a question.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Awesome. I'm curious. So I guess my first question is, how are the graphs stored? Do you know if they're stored as like adjacency matrices or a linked list or something else? Or
they're stored. So we have a custom network representation that we use, but they're stored as adjacency lists, not as matrices.
Okay, makes sense. And I'm curious about this reproduction. How exactly are the changes, or how exactly are the characteristics inherited from the 2 parents?
So each of the neurons in these networks have unique IDs associated with them. And in all of our networks, they have the same input and output neurons. So they have the same IDs because the problem defines what our inputs and outputs are going to look like. And so those have the same, and we know that those are the same neurons in each of our individuals in the population. And then the other neurons will inherit the characteristics of those IDs from their parents. So there will be shared IDs of neurons across the population. So we can say that's the same neuron that I'm seeing across all of these individuals. That's ID 13. And neuron 13 is the same neuron across each individual. This network representation is by far the hardest and most custom part of the way that we do EONs, and we're constantly trying to improve the way that crossover and mutation is done. Crossover is harder, but this is still an active area of study. Like, we have a way that crossover works right now, but my students are actually currently evaluating new crossover operations as well to try to make this as close to what's happening in what we can see in biological systems as possible.
Very cool, thanks.
So mutation is easier. Mutation is taking, for example, one of the individuals, and we can do things like add or delete neurons, add or delete synapses, and randomly change parameter values. So this is one where both a synapse was deleted between these two neurons, and this particular parameter value was switched to a new value through a mutation. So we then go back, we continue this process. We do that same loop that you saw in the earlier example over the course of multiple generations. Question from the chat: do we do a topology settling operation like SCDP after casting the topology? It depends on the hardware backend. Sometimes we will do this. Sometimes we'll include something like SCDP during the evolutionary process. So it's also updating the network during the fitness evaluation. It's up to you for your particular hardware platform if that's something that's reasonable for you, or if you want to do that in simulation, we can also support that. So I will pause here and say, I have told you about all of the cool advantages of evolutionary approaches. The biggest downside that I'm sure you're all probably familiar with is that it can take a while for these systems to converge. We joke this is why the acronym is EONs here. It's actually not that bad. You can still usually get to a pretty good solution, depending on your problem, on the order of hours to a day. All the results you're going to see throughout this talk, we got solutions on the order of hours on like my laptop. These scale really nicely. So if you happen to have larger compute resources, you can leverage whatever resources you have to get to better solutions faster. And the real bottleneck of the evolutionary process is the fitness evaluation, the evaluation and ranking, where for us, that's typically because we're simulating something in the hardware or on an application, and you're really bottlenecked by how fast you can do that to get to a better result. Yes, it is similar to NEAT. Yes, NEAT had some specific characteristics targeting particular types of network designs, but this idea is very similar to what's going on with NEAT. There is no big O value for convergence time for these. This is a random process. Do all of the attributes of the parents are inherited, or some subset of the attributes? All of the attributes from the parents are inherited into the children, the structure and the parameters of the network. And we try to set it up so that this particular example doesn't show that, but in our actual EONs implementation, if you have two parents, and all of their characteristics are going to be inherited in one of the children. So even if a synapse is not captured in one network, it's going to be captured in the other network. So with that, I'm now going to go into how we use evolution for co-design. So the first case study that I want to go through is our memristive neuromorphic hardware implementation in collaboration with Garrett Rose's team here at the University of Tennessee. And so we had started now 5 or 6 years ago developing this memristive neuromorphic system called Mr. DANA, Memristive Dynamic Adaptive Neural Network Arrays. So if you're familiar with memristive neuromorphic systems, typically you think about them in crossbars. We were not using a crossbar architecture with our memristors. Instead, We have memristive neural cores in the Mr. Dana system, each of which has a neuron and some number of memristive synapses with synaptic drivers. And you can see what these synaptic driver block look like here. I'm not the hardware designer. I'm here to apply evolution to help us understand whether or not different components in this circuit are useful, and also what types of devices we might actually want to use for the memristors. So we worked alongside our hardware developers in Garrett's team. Our students on the computer science side of our group work very closely with the electrical engineering and computer engineering students. And we worked with them to take their spice level simulation and cadence specter and replicate phenomenological abstract level behaviors in a higher level simulator in C++. Could we have used the spice level simulator as part of with eons? Absolutely. Did we want to? No, it's so slow. So we wanted, and it doesn't scale well to larger networks. So we wanted to evaluate on a higher level simulator. So we built this and we matched the behavior of it to the low level, the behaviors that we actually cared about capturing to the low level simulation. One of the things that the students used eons for is to evaluate what the impact of different memristive metal oxide materials would have on the energy usage of our resulting networks. And so the student who did this was Gangatri Shakma. She evaluated across 3 different types of metal oxide memristors: hafnium oxide, titanium oxide, and tantalum oxide, that have different low resistance and high resistance states. And we used eons to evolve networks for simple classification tasks for each of these. And the accuracies were the same across all of the different implementations. So it didn't matter what the material was that was being used to implement the device. We still got to similar accuracies, but the energy usages were different, which may be important for your application. So with this sort of workflow, where we were using eons to tune for each individual device type, we could get similar performance, but we could then look and see how the energy usage differed across the different components. One of the big questions, and I know this hopefully will resonate with people who do hardware design, I, as the algorithm developer, am constantly asking for features in the hardware. And my hardware designing colleagues sometimes are very excited to implement those, and sometimes hate me every time I ask them for a new feature. And so one of the things that we do is we study in simulation what the impact of the inclusion of different features are. And because we're using evolution, evolution will try to leverage whatever features you give it, or it will try to operate under whatever constraints it's trying to operate within. So one of the things that we wanted to evaluate was the impact of the inclusion of a simple synaptic plasticity mechanism on performance. This was inspired by, it's a very simplistic version of STDP that we implemented in the hardware. And what we found, we compared the performance of networks with and without this plasticity mechanism. And we found that including the plasticity mechanism actually did have an impact on the resulting application performance. This was tuned over the course of training and then also included during the testing procedure. And you can see the blue is where we included it during training and testing. The orange is where we trained and tested without the inclusion of this component. Now, what's important to note here, 1, these are simple tasks, but 2, the accuracy differences aren't that much. So one question we then had to ask ourselves is the extra circuitry involved, is the extra energy usage required to implement this component worth the small increase in accuracy that we saw in performance? That's a question that's still ongoing in the design of our systems as we continue to evaluate them. And so we are using these co-design efforts to inform the chips that we are actually taping out. So we are actively doing this co-design process on our new version of our memristive hardware, Ravens. So we took a lot of the design decisions we learned over the course of the co-design process in Mr. Dana. We plugged those into what we're doing with Ravens now. And we are currently taping out a second version of our Raven system. This is a piece of the wafer for our first version. And we are actively doing all of this simulation. Our fabrication partners at SUNY Polytech in Albany have different memristive systems. They have both hafnium oxide, which is what we've fabricated previously, but they also are looking at tantalum oxide. So we're exploring what the impact of those two different types of materials are on the ultimate performance in simulation. We're also actively looking at the different hardware features that our students are implementing, and we're evaluating whether or not those are useful in the actual application domain. So this is ongoing work that our group is actively doing to inform the resulting system that we are fabricating. Okay, so that is one case study. That's, of course, within our group here at Tennessee. This other case study that I wanted to give you was where we talked about that co-design process with Mr. Dana at the Rebooting Computing conference. And we were approached by Sonia Buckley at NIST, who I'm sure some of you know, because they were working on a neuromorphic system based on superconducting optoelectronic neurons. And they actually had multiple neuron models that they had been developing. So this is the flip side to the hardware. People hate it when I come to them with features. They also love to build cool stuff in hardware. I'm sure y'all can resonate with that. And so they liked building different neuron models, different ways you could do that. But the question was, like, are they actually useful? Like, which ones of these are good for different applications? So they had two candidate neuron models that they wanted to evaluate. They had SPICE level simulators for both of these. We worked with them. We sat down, our students sat down with them in a couple of days and hammered out simulations that captured the behavior that they needed to capture in a higher level C++ simulation. And the key question that the NIST folks were interested in was which model performed best on a particular application. And we actually looked at 6 different versions of their hardware implementation that had different synaptic weight precision levels. It had different delay values on their, or axonal delay values on their neurons, and they had different leak time constants associated with their neurons. So they picked out a set of applications that they were interested in. I'm not going to go through all of them, but I just wanted to give you a flavor for the sort of thing that we saw over the course of the experiment. So one of the things we looked at was a streaming exclusive OR task, and we actually found this was something they were interested in looking at, that the higher range of synaptic weights actually hurt the performance of the task in this case, meaning that they didn't need that level of precision on that particular task. But on the pole balancing task, which is one they were interested in, it did help performance. So there was not a conclusive decision here, and this is where weighing out like which of these application types are most important to them was then a question that they could start to address. One of the big ones that we found, they were very interested in this cart pole problem, pole balancing, inverted pendulum, however you want to think about it, the problem without velocity. If you're solving this problem without velocities as input, you need memory in your network. And we found, we didn't try to train to get the best possible networks here, but we found that if you did not have, in this case, it was axonal delay in the model, it could not solve the problem. It could not solve the problem. And delay is expensive to implement in hardware, but this was a property that they knew they wanted in their system. And this justified that they needed to look at including axonal delay in some of their hardware implementations. So those are a couple of the places where we evaluated both of the materials, the device, and the circuit level for co-design. Another example that I want to give you is where we were in a situation where somebody had approached us with a device that had never been evaluated in the construct of neuromorphic before, and they weren't sure if it was even feasible to use it for neuromorphic. So this was a process where we weren't doing any design tuning with evolution. We were literally just asking, like, does it even make sense to use this for neuromorphic? So this is by far the weirdest device I've ever worked with, and that's saying something because there's a lot of weird devices in neuromorphic. But this was with some folks in the mechanical engineering department here at the University of Tennessee. And if you see me pointing, it's because their building is right there, and the lab where they made these is like 50 yards from me right now. So what they did is they took water droplets encased in lipids and they squished them together. And by applying a voltage to one side, it can open ion channels in the membrane between those two water droplets. In this case, it was alamethicin channels that were inserted. And you can read out a current on the other side. And turns out that that sort of behavior sort of looks like what a chemical synapse does. So the question was like, okay, well, it maybe can act like a chemical synapse. They did some characterization and saw, okay, well, it's exhibiting natural short-term plasticity, paired pulse facilitation, and paired pulse depression in the device. And they made all this stuff, and they like physically made them, and by easily fabricated on a small scale, I mean that a graduate student pipetted these onto electrodes, and I watched him do it in the lab, like right there. And you had to stand very still because the early days, they were very fragile. But they had made these and they had done this characterization and said, okay, it has these short-term plasticity mechanisms in the way that it behaves. Is that useful? Like, we have no idea, right? It's like something we know we see in biology, but it's like, is it useful or is it just a consequence of how the materials that are made up in the brain? We don't know. So we implemented these. We did this exact same procedure. We worked with them to implement an analytical model of the DIB behavior and then created a software simulation of a DIB network. And then we used eons to train a network with these as the synapses and solid state leaky integrating fire neurons as the neurons. And we found that, yeah, 100%, these can behave as synapses. Now, I'm going to note, these don't have memory. You can't store weight on these. They only have their behavior that changes as a result of the spikes coming in and doing this pulse paired facilitation and depression. And so we did find we had to include a delay. So there had to be a delay component on it. And you had to allow it to be excitatory and inhibitory, although in this example, all of them are excitatory. But besides just excitatory and inhibitory, just having the behavior changing as a result of the incoming spikes, as you saw on that previous slide, gave us enough power to be able to solve multiple tasks, including an EEG classification. And I'll note that this EEG classification distinguishing between healthy and epileptic signals, 6 neurons and 6 synapses. So also a very, very small network. This is still something that we are actively working on. We just had a meeting last week because there are a lot of options of the types of materials that you use in the membrane, the ion channel types that you're evaluating. All of those change the characteristics of these systems. So there's a lot of area for co-design that we can explore here as well. And we're looking at more than just biological sort of materials. In this case, it was lipids, as I noted on the as part of the membranes. We're also looking at polymers, which are a little bit more robust to somebody jumping around in the lab, which was not a thing we were allowed to do. So I also mentioned in the co-design processes, we're looking at these hardware implementations. One of the big advantages of evolutionary approaches is the fact that you can do multi-objective optimization in a relatively easy way. So we've done this with eons, where we've included additional objectives beyond training accuracy or performance on the task. We've looked at minimizing energy usage, minimizing network size, and improving resilience. And you update the fitness function to encourage different properties of the network. So what you can see in this slide here is no multi-objective and multi-objective. The no multi-objective are shown in blue and the orange are the multi-objective optimization results. The objective here was to try to minimize the network size, which typically has a consequence of also minimizing energy usage. And what you can see is that when we included the additional objective, it didn't really hurt the testing accuracy on our simple classification tasks at all. But what it did do was significantly drop the number of neurons and synapses required to solve the task. So we were not including any objective about network size. It could do whatever it needed to solve the task. But as soon as we added that additional objective, it can significantly decrease the network size. We did this also with resiliency. And what you can see here is what that fitness function looked like for one of our tasks. So we have weighting factors for our different objectives. I'm going to come back to this because this is where I have a cautionary tale. Different weighting factors here. This was the original score on the task for our network. 300 was the maximum score on this task. It was another pole balancing task. And we also included a size multiplier to encourage smaller networks. And then there was another factor that we included, which was how the network performed in the face of perturbations. So we looked at, for example, 2 perturbed versions of that network and evaluated how well it performed on the task in each of those and took the average of those scores. So what this fitness function tells us is that in order to do well on this task, the network has to natively do well on the task, which is what we always want it to do. It needs to be small because we're penalizing it for larger networks here. And it also has to perform well in the face of perturbation. So all of those things have to be happening simultaneously to get a good score on the task. So doing this, including this resiliency component as part of our optimization, we saw significantly better resiliency, as you would expect, in our resulting network performance compared to those that were just optimized with size. This is my cautionary tale. If you pick the weighting factors incorrectly, bad stuff can happen. So I'm going to go back to this particular set of results here, and I'm going to walk you through a case study of picking the weighting factors incorrectly. So suppose you have a classification task, a binary classification task, where your training set is exactly balanced. And you are simultaneously wanting to maximize accuracy on the training set and minimize network size in terms of number of neurons and number of synapses. A good local optimum in the design space is no network whatsoever, because it has 0 neurons and synapses, which is the best possible thing you can do, and it gets 50% accuracy on your training set because it's always giving the same answer. Not ideal. And we've seen this happen. If you accidentally set your weights incorrectly, you can accidentally lead yourself into a, this is good. You told me this was pretty good. You actually want your performance to be a little bit higher weighted there than minimizing network size. So finding the right weightings is non-trivial. So now I will go into a little bit about what we've done within COINFLIPS. So we've combined a lot of these ideas into one of the projects that we've done here. We are going to be using EONs for circuit design and optimization, but right now we're leveraging LEAP, which is the Library of Evolutionary Algorithms in Python, which is exactly what it sounds like. It's a really nice library, open source library that implements a wide variety of evolutionary algorithmic approaches. Pretty easy for novices to pick up, and I happen to know the developers, so if you want to use it and you need a feature and it's not there, we can complain to them. In this case, we used abstracted device models for tunnel diodes and magnetic tunneling junctions, which we were capturing functionality and energy usage. We were doing a very specific task where we were looking at a hidden dependence model for a process where we were doing random number generation. And the goal for our evolutionary approach was to pick these values, this W, P1, Q1, P2, and Q2. P1, Q1, P2, and Q2 were the weights on our coins in our process, and W was a weighting factor that was being used as part of this hidden process. So we did a multi-objective optimization for this task, and we were looking at doing random number generation, drawing from a particular distribution. So our performance metric, like accuracy on the task, was we wanted to minimize KL divergence. We wanted to look like our result came from the distribution that we were interested in drawing from. But because we were working with real device models, we had talked to the device developers and found that it was easier to have weights on our coins that were closer to fair coins. So we included a metric that said we're going to penalize as it gets further away from a fair coin. And we also used energy usage of the weight values that we were selecting as one of the components that we were including in our objective. So we want, in this case, instead of maximizing the fitness score, we were trying to minimize this value. Now you'll note that there are 3 weight values here, omega-1, omega-2, and omega-3, that are weighting those different objectives. And this was another case where we had to be very careful about how we selected those values, because as you can see in these 3 different plots, plotting KL divergence versus energy usage and the weighting of our different values. So this plot is omega-1, omega-2, and omega-3. Depending on how you selected those values, it landed you in a very different region of the search space. But this is also good because it allows us to explore trade-offs in our application. So maybe we didn't want our energy usage to go much higher than this level right here, but we needed our KL divergence to be below a certain value. This lets you sort of explore those different search spaces. And I want to note that these experiments were all done in collaboration with all the folks in this project, and my student, Karan, who was on the call, ran a lot of these experiments. So one of the other things here with evolution is that it is tailoring to the underlying device types. And so we looked at different weights of our different objectives here, and you can see the resulting best performing runs for our 3 different device types. What this means is the fact that these are different colors for the different devices just means that it tailored the parameter optimization to that particular device characteristics to get the best performance out of each of those. And what we really like about this approach is that the framework that we've developed can accommodate any emerging device type plugged into this. So as we start to look at other devices, other materials that are being used to implement these, we can accommodate that within the framework that we've developed. So some of the opportunities moving forward and what I hope have sparked some ideas for y'all, there's a lot of opportunities for evolution, for evaluating and optimizing system level design decisions across multiple applications. So we can not only tailor for a particular application, but look at a suite of applications. We can use multi-objective optimization to investigate trade-offs in the design space of devices, circuits, and systems. We can do circuit topology design using EONs. So we've used EONs in the past to do spiky neural network design, but EONs really is just optimizing graphs or networks. And then it doesn't care that the nodes and edges are represented using neurons and synapses in neuromorphic. It's just optimizing nodes and edges with some number of parameters. We can easily extend EONs to do that. We've already started looking at that a bit as part of COINFLIPS. And then looking more on the neuromorphic side, we can explore the impact of stochastic neurons and synapses on neuromorphic application performance. And this is something that we're actively working on as well. Shameless plug. I am on a panel talking about AI for co-design, where I talk about COINFLIPS, I talk about some of these projects. This panel is coming up on March 21st. GTC is at GTC. It's free to register for it if you're interested in attending. The other folks on the panel are 2 folks from NVIDIA, Nina Imam. Names are escaping me, professor from Stanford, and another high-level person at NVIDIA focused on fabrication. Talking about using AI for microelectronics. So if you're interested in attending, I would encourage you to do that. I want to thank everybody on this project, including and especially Suma, who I shamelessly stole slides from to talk about the COINFLIPS work, as well as the folks at 10 Lab and at Oak Ridge who were collaborators on this project. I'm going to thank you, and I'm going to go to the chat for the initial questions. Yes, multi-objective GA with NSGA2, which returns solutions along the Pareto front. Absolutely. In fact, that was the feature that I requested in LEAP that is now in the development branch that we are going to pick up and use as part of COINFLIPS, because we were doing the weighted optimization of the different objectives, but NSGA2 is now supported in LEAP because we requested it for this project. So I'm serious when I say if you need a feature, I will go to them and tell them that we need it. It is extremely finicky, so finicky, but we now have NSGA2 so that we can use it effectively. And then what do I mean by co-design? I mean that we're using what we're doing in the applications to drive what's going on in the hardware, and then we're also using the development in the hardware to drive what applications we can address. So we're taking this loop of co-design to say, I'm not just designing in isolation, I'm designing with everything in my compute stack in mind simultaneously. Why are we not using Deep instead of LEAP? LEAP naturally scales. It is as part of its design decision in the software. They implemented a scalable to HPC implementation. It was developed by a researcher at Oak Ridge in collaboration with some folks in academia. So it's specifically targeted to scale on systems like HPC level systems like Summit and Frontier, so that we can leverage all the compute if you happen to have it. And I know them. So if it doesn't work, I just ask. That's a selfish reason, though.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Katie. You were really on those chat questions too. This was a fantastic talk.
Can you tell that I'm a professor?